Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Preparing for the Era of Mandatory Human Rights Due Diligence. I am Prabina from Q Studios, and I will be a technical facilitator for today. Both the chat function and Q&A. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Please note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message TF Prabina for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to our moderator for the day, Sean Lees. Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Prabina, and greetings, everyone. I am Sean Lees, the Business and Human Rights Specialist for UNDP Business and Human Rights in Asia program. I'm very grateful to be here in this session, preparing for the era of human rights, or rather mandatory human rights due diligence. Our aim with this session is to understand what mandatory human rights due diligence is, how the agenda is moving forward in Europe, and what the implications are for the rest of South Asia, and indeed beyond South Asia, for the rest of the world. And I am joined today by four esteemed panelists who will offer their perspectives in this regard. Our first speaker is Tim Felder. Tim has been a trade unionist for most of his professional career. He tells me that he is now living the dream in India as a counselor for social and labor affairs at the German embassy in India. We welcome Tim. After Tim, we'll hear from Zoha Shahid, who is the Senior Research Associate for the Research Society for International Law, Islamabad. She also happens to be the youngest person at this year's South Asia Forum. And indeed, she's a big believer in the untapped power of the youth to move the business and human rights agenda forward. And I hope she'll speak more to that today. After Zoha, we'll hear from Namit Agarwal, the Asia Pacific lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Namit told me recently on the phone that he's a big fan of disruption because the disruption he sees is leading to significant innovation and solutions in India and elsewhere in South Asia. Finally, after Namit, we'll hear from Muriel Trebesh, who is the Lobby and Advocacy Coordinator for Clean Clothes Campaign. In a phone call I had with her recently, she told me that she used to work in forests. And she said you'd be surprised at how many commonalities there are between trees and t-shirts. So some fascinating stuff from some fascinating participants today. I'll be using this whiteboard behind me from time to time to capture some of the ideas I think are important, but do use the Q&A and or chat box there for questions or important messages that you'd like me to register up on our board. Before we begin, just a quick check-in. Make sure that everybody who's attending today is aware of what human rights due diligence is. So quick definition, and then we'll dive right in. Human rights due diligence is defined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as a multi-stakeholder process that businesses routinely engage in to identify and assess, mitigate the human rights risks they're posing through their operations. It is a four-step process. I won't detail it. I won't provide too much detail, but to say it involves identification as a first step, integration of solutions as a second step, tracking your solutions for their performance, and then fourth, communicating your results with the public. With those issues, or rather with that introduction behind us, I would now like to introduce Tim Felder with our first question. Tim, looks like you're safely ensconced in your office now, having just arrived in Kerala. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Very good, very good. Well, and Tim, please tell us about Germany's proposed human rights due diligence law. Where are we with this proposal in Germany? Give us a basic framework. What does it contain? And what's the reception been by the German trade unions, business, and civil society?
Should I start with the slides or
whatever you want? Yeah, slides be good.
Maybe, first of all, thank you for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, namaste. Maybe to go with the slides is the best way. When we can start it, please. I want to start with this remarkable issue with Heida Hautler, the Green Group spokesman in the European Parliament. She said, as long we turn a blind eye to human rights violations in corporate value chains, we reward these who break laws. It should be the other way around. Through setting a legal standard, we give responsible and sustainable companies a business advantage. I think we can discuss it with Muriel later on, what's going on in the European Union. And so we start with our legal framework, the step, what is made in Germany. Our Minister for Labor and Social Affairs, he said these planned supply chain law, what is discussed in Germany, is ambitious and so far the far-reaching human rights due diligence rule in the world. It could be if the parliament is passing it. To the beginning, the legal framework on business and human rights. No, please, the next slide. Thank you. On the 3rd of March 2021, not so long ago, the German government adopted a draft law on mandatory human rights due diligence for German enterprises to be discussed in the German parliament in June. There could be some changes, so I won't go into detail of this law. So we have to wait until the parliamentary session in June is going by. And but the objective is clear, and hence the respect for human rights in business relations throughout the supply chains and at home and abroad. And this is very important. So the draft was preceded by a very intensive national debate about the cornerstones of the law the last few months, reflecting the different perspectives and interests between stakeholders. There's on the one hand the entities. They are a little bit wondering in which direction it's going, and on the other hand the non-governmental organizations and the trade unions, and it's a vital discussion in the public. It has been and it's still going on. What is very important in this point, that surveys also showed that up to 75%, 3/3 of the Germans support legally binding measures, for example, a supply chain law. So it's based on a big majority in the society, and this is very, very important. It was a long process to it. It started around 2010, 2011, and so it went on, and just to stress these obligations, and that leads to further action, but I will go to this point later on. Starting from 2023, so it's planned and so it's passed through the parliament. Companies based in Germany above a certain size, it is in the discussion that it's starting with entities with 3,000 employees and more. These are about 600 companies in Germany in the moment, will be required to continuously implement of risk management process on human rights and environmental standards. And it should cover especially their own operations, direct and indirect suppliers in a tiered approach. So the most important is tier 1, their own company, and then it goes on and on and on. The new mandatory regulation is a consequence of the German National Action Plan. It was enacted in 2016 and lasted until 2020. So what is this National Action Plan? The federal government of Germany attaches great importance to worldwide protection and promotion of business and human rights, working for, and therefore they have been working on a systematic implementation of the guiding principles of business and human rights, and of course the ILO tripartite regulations. So the German National Action Plan, as I said, was enacted in 2016 to highlight duties and responsibilities of the state and business, respectively in terms of human rights and when doing business in Germany and abroad. Within the scope of monitoring process carried out between 2018 and 2020, this is very special in this National Action Plan. It's not only a descriptive thing. It has the monitoring in it, and if the monitoring doesn't lead to a good end, that the majority of the entities will follow these obligations on the voluntary basis. So then it follows something mandatory, and the survey was a little bit, for some not astonishing, for some really astonishing, that only 13 until 17% of the companies are fulfilling their obligations out of the National Action Plan. 10 to 12% are on the good path, they are well done now, and the rest struggles with the commitments. So the target of at least 50% NAP compliers had not been achieved. And this triggered the drafting process of the supply chain. And this is a special thing in the German National Action Plan. And if the government, if the parliament is passing this law, then it directly has lead to this legislative framework. And I mentioned it that in June 2020, there was this ongoing process, and now it's on the way to the parliament. Next slide, please. These law, and I do it a little bit as an overview. To go too much into detail, we just, I think we have other opportunities in later 2021 to show it and to explain it. But in the beginning of the act, shall only apply to companies domiciled in Germany, which employ more than 3,000 employees. As I said, including, but this is very important, employees in foreign affiliate companies and where the major decision was taken in Germany. The due diligence shall be in line with the standards set by the United Nations and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The risk analysis shall cover the company's own activities and also those of companies' business partner, those related to the products and service along the whole value chain. Some companies, big companies, have 16,000 suppliers and more. It's a huge thing, so we will see how it will work. And companies with identified risks shall take adequate preventive measures, monitor them, and provide a grievance mechanism, plus staff trainings and contractual code of conduct. And such as federal authorities shall have investigation rights. There is this thought that there is an institution within the Ministry of Finance to control it, the so-called BAFA. And it could be that there are more than 50 people are working on this issue. But every time I have to say it has to pass the parliament. So, Sean, should I go forward or should I go through this?
I'd like to ask a couple questions while we're at it right here, if you don't mind, and if there's still time, we can continue to go forward. One of the questions that I have, given your background, working with trade unionists, as a trade unionist, but also with civil society, can you give us a feeling of just who was pushing this new NAP so hard, and who was pushing the HRDD components so hard there in Germany? As a first question, then I have maybe one or two more.
Germany has a long tradition of these pressure groups of employers on the one hand and the trade unions on the other end. We call it a social partnership. And the whole construction of work and labor is combined with this social partnership. The negotiations about wages and working conditions are going not with the state, they are going through trade unions and employers. And in terms of business and human rights, there are so many NGOs engaging for fair and better trade, and started in 2010 and plus, just to stress, because then and after Rana Plaza, the discussion rises totally up. And therefore, this National Action Plan is a result of these public discussions, how far German companies should be responsible for the supply chain, in which degree. And there is now a broad initiative that called Lieferketten-Initiative, supply chain initiative. And they are doing a lot of lobbying and wide activities in the public. So and the media is reacting on it, and therefore it is explainable why three of four Germans saying, okay, it's okay to do it in a law, to not to buy products where you don't know where it comes from and under which condition it was produced. So in the end, it was the lead that was coming so far, and it's I think it's a game changer, these pressure groups and these public discussions about it. It's a game changer for public awareness, and in the end,
but it certainly sounds that way. I mean, I've written up here intensive national debate going on in Germany. That's in sharp contrast with some of the national action plans that have risen more recently in Asia, where it's more of a top-down. It's more of the government and big business saying this is good for our country. We need to start talking about this. So it's interesting that in Germany, it actually sounds like a bottom-up approach where you have a strong. Perhaps it's well, to get to 75% support, in fact, you got to have an all-in approach, don't you? It's not necessarily a grassroots approach, is it?
You're right.
I also put down here how the NAP actually has driven the legislation, and that's a sign of a very powerful NAP and a worthy NAP to take forward. There is some criticism out there that some NAPs sit on the shelf after they're written and they don't have the impact. Clearly in Germany they do. Just a last point that I thought was important is that this applies to large companies, 3,000 or more, I think you said.
In the beginning.
In the beginning, yes, indeed. And then later to 1,000 and more. A graduated approach. There's probably some very good logic behind it. There is, of course, an EU proposal submitted by Parliament just a few days after Germany's proposal, I think, was submitted to its Parliament. And of course, there's a different approach to that figure, which with regards to large enterprises. We won't unpack that just now because I'd like to move on to our next speaker, if possible. But thank you so much for the comments, Tim. You set us off on the right foot. Next, I'd like to speak to Zoha. Zoha Shahid. Yesterday, you were in a panel on national action plans, and you detailed the process there quite extensively. I don't want you to go over that material again, as interesting as it was, but instead, can I ask you to focus on that section of the NAP in Pakistan that focuses itself on human rights due diligence? Tell us, what does it say there? What do we need to know?
Right. Thank you so much, Sean, and thank you for having me on this panel with such esteemed panelists. Before I actually start unpacking the section on due diligence within the National Action Plan, it's very important to draw context here as to why due diligence is so important within Pakistan. Globally, we've seen there have been grave violations of human rights through business activity, and we've seen that in Pakistan as well. We have countless examples such as the fire at Ali Enterprises, which killed 255 people. We have the example of the fire at Rajpur Polyester in Lahore, which killed 23 people. And what is interesting about the Ali Enterprises case is that during investigations, it was revealed that a false certification had been given to the company 22 days before the incident. So our challenges right now are not just to introduce due diligence. Our challenges are to first identify what we prioritize as human rights, and then to identify how we're not only conducting due diligence, but also taking a cross-sectional approach towards it, and also ensuring whether it is actually being conducted properly. Because especially with developing countries, and something that I have observed within Pakistan at least, policies are made, new guidance is given, but it is not implemented properly. The fact that there are laws related to occupational health and safety and certifications were provided to Ali Enterprises, but still something as tragic as the fire happened, means that we're not only looking at developing sufficient and adequate procedures, but we're also looking towards adequate implementation. We have countless challenges that include occupational health and safety measures, child labor within supply chains, bonded labor that, even though is prohibited, is continuing and persistent within supply chains, and we find evidence of that. And the environment and inhumane conditions in which workers work. And we would like to emphasize here today that while you are conducting due diligence, we're not only looking at how companies or businesses are impacting their own employees, we're also trying to identify and persuade businesses to look at the impact that they have on the communities in which they operate. And prior to the National Action Plan, our research has shown that there is no framework on due diligence in Pakistan. The only evidence of due diligence that we find is within environmental law, where in Pakistan, Environmental Protection Act 1997 states that where you are conducting a large infrastructural project, it needs to be preceded by an environmental impact assessment. But other than that, we do not find mechanisms for human rights due diligence that need to be conducted. So of course, on that context, the section on due diligence within the newly published, the first draft of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is to be welcomed. But when you look at the section, it identifies 4 action points upon which the government is trying to work on. Initially, it says that the NAP is going to aim to develop and launch a partnership project with private sector enterprises on due diligence reporting. Now, of course, this is one of the requirements that is to be welcomed. The first step towards introducing due diligence in Pakistan in an area where the concept of human rights due diligence is alien is to ensure that there is a very smart mix of voluntary and mandatory human rights due diligence mechanisms. So it is interesting to see that the National Action Plan starts with a voluntary partnership. This partnership is extremely important. Why? Because you're trying to, at this point, persuade businesses that this is something beneficial for them. And we're trying to give them data. For example, in 2014, Walt Disney banned imports from Pakistan. This led to a loss of $200 million in exports of textile products in Pakistan. Moreover, our GSP plus status heavily depends on better governance standards and the protection of human rights. So with this context, we go to businesses and we tell them that we're here to create a partnership with you. The Ministry of Human Rights is not forcing you to conduct human rights due diligence right now, but we're only in the process of guiding you through this so that it is something that can be voluntarily taken up, and it is something that can lead to an excellent basis for mandatory human rights due diligence in the future as well. So initially, the National Action Plan talks about launching this partnership. I would like to see how that works, and I would really like to see what sectors they include within this partnership, because it is, again, as we've discussed, it is easier to create policies where a top-down approach is taken and the government engages with larger businesses and larger corporations who already have some form of human rights component to their policies. But it will be interesting to see whether smaller businesses where they prioritize their economic interests will be part of this partnership and will be persuaded to ensure that human rights due diligence mechanisms and due diligence reporting is part of their business activity as well. Secondly, the NAB aims to enact voluntary standards of human rights due diligence and provide incentives to businesses so that they conduct human rights due diligence effectively. Now, I understand voluntary standards and why that is needed in Pakistan, because again, you have businesses which prioritize their economic interests, which are not ready to be forced into conducting any sort of procedure that might lose money for them. So right now, what we can do at the initial stages of not just publishing a national action plan, but even through implementation, we can start with voluntary standards. But I would really like to see what type of incentives the government is trying to give to these businesses. Because from my perspective, a developing country like Pakistan, which has introduced a national action plan, but has not costed it at all, cannot give subsidies to these businesses or is not relying on subsidies right now. So what I would like to see is what kind of incentives they're trying to give to these businesses. What are we looking at? Are we looking at certifications from the businesses? Because that would be a good idea. We now understand that human rights due diligence and protection of human rights standards within business activity is a prerequisite to conducting business outside of Pakistan as well. If you want to engage with larger brands, especially within the garment industry, you have to conduct human rights due diligence. So one way of persuading businesses and encouraging them to create these voluntary standards of human rights due diligence can be to provide certification, so they have some evidence of the effectiveness of their human rights due diligence mechanisms as well. Because firstly, you can start by certifications, but moreover, I would like to see where the government goes with this and where the government tries to identify how this can move on to a more mandatory approach, which is interesting because the last 2 points of the National Action Plan, or the last 2 action points, do give us some semblance of mandatory human rights reporting as well. The third point within the National Action Plan is that the NAP requires human rights due diligence in large-scale projects where the business activity poses a significant risk on the rights of a community at large, and aims to make this requirement mandatory for the approval of licenses and permits for large-scale projects. Now, this is a very interesting requirement because we have moved from initiating private partnerships to requiring human rights due diligence as an obligation when you're conducting large-scale projects. But from the perspective of the civil society, or even from the perspective of the business community, the government here has to identify and to clarify what large-scale projects are. What sectors are going to be mandated to conduct human rights due diligence? What are the sectors that we're looking at? What kind of large-scale projects are we looking at? Is there a standard that we have to look at to identify when mandatory human rights due diligence procedures apply to us? And considering that we've conducted consultations with the business community, it will be interesting to see how this actually pans out. Because from what we've seen up, at least for the 2 years that we've been working on consulting with relevant stakeholders and identifying the extent to which they are ready to carry out human rights due diligence, what needs to be seen is whether they're going to be receptive of a mandatory human rights due diligence requirement at this stage. Because again, we're coming from a country where the concept of business and human rights is alien, where the concept of business and human rights is extremely new to us. So we're not only looking at a lot of resistance, but we're also trying to look at and to create this awareness that human rights and business activity are not two distinct concepts, and they have to be integrated and they have to be looked at in the same lens. Finally, the National Action Plan states that there will be a requirement to create human rights due diligence reports for companies of all sizes, which is to be available to the public. And this will allow a collection of data on the actual and potential impacts of corporate activity on human rights, which can lead to creating awareness and understanding about the impact of new projects on the fundamental rights of the parties that are being affected. Again, this is a very interesting requirement because we live in a country where disclosure of data and transparency has always been a challenge. So it will be interesting to see how receptive businesses are to that, especially within the consultations that have taken place up till now. We see a lot of resistance because businesses believe that if they start collecting data and if they start sharing it publicly, there will be a lot of backlash. There will be a lot of liability that they will be subjected to. So right now, the process needs to look at how effective dissemination and persuasion can be. And lastly, I think there are two very interesting points that I would like to make here. The first is we live in a decentralized country. We have a decentralized system of governance where the federal government can create these standards, but it is up to the provincial government to actually implement them. The National Action Plan within the due diligence section does not really talk about how provincial governments are going to do that. And lastly, it is going to be very interesting to see how human rights due diligence mechanisms apply to special economic zones. Because we've recently seen with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a $45.6 billion project, Pakistan is going to prioritize its economic interests. Special economic zones are governed by their own regulatory frameworks, and they are not regulated by the laws that exist in the country right now. So it will be interesting to see whether the National Action Plan applies to special economic zones or whether human rights due diligence actually applies, because without it, special economic zones will continue to be outside of this regulatory framework, which is something that ideally should not happen. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you, Zoha. That was a really rich review of the really the accelerated pace of developments there in Pakistan, but also a really rich review of all the challenges. And maybe I'll focus on that latter point here. For me, a very important point is that you stated a really key theme of what you've said is that implementation is a huge challenge in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And you noted that occupational health and safety remains a problem, bonded labor, child labor. You did say that perhaps in the environment is the only place where you find any mention of due diligence that's worth referencing, and that's as old as 1997. So it's been a long time since we've approached this subject in Pakistan with the full weight that you are today. You said too that the NAP reflects what needs to happen in Pakistan. We need to start with a voluntary approach there. We need to start with a partnership, I think you said, with business to actually see human rights due diligence have its intended effect. You cannot simply legislate it and it will not simply come to be because you've legislated it. You need to get people on board themselves. I really appreciate that comments. You also spent a little bit of time on incentives here. You've said subsidies are not a good idea in your mind, but certification certainly is. You've also said that disclosures is a major sore point, a major worry point for business in Pakistan, and yet reporting and disclosures is for some people the first step of mandatory human rights due diligence. If we don't have reporting, whether it's a stock exchange, in your filings with shareholders on non-financial disclosures, etc., what progress can be made? I want to come back to a question for you, but I think I'll leave it for later because I want to make sure each of our speakers gets equal time. And so I just want to say how thrilled I am by the conversation we've had already. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving along now, Namit, working with the organization you do, many of your members are, in fact, all of your members perhaps are from the business sector. And so I think you have a good idea for how the South Asian business community is reacting to developments out of Europe and elsewhere on mandatory human rights due diligence. Can you give us a picture of how businesses are reacting to this?
Thanks, Sean, for having me here. And I would also echo a lot what Zoha just said, because a lot of the challenges are absolutely similar in the Indian context with relation to policy implementation and all of the OHS, bonded and child labor issues that exist in India as well. First of all, I think when we talk about the business community in South Asia, it is not a homogeneous group. So it's very, very important to unpack it and see what are the different sections and subsections within the business community, because it comprises of large foreign multinationals. A lot of them are from Europe and North America, large regional and national companies who are also so-called homegrown multinational corporations. and then a very, very significant number of small and medium and micro enterprises. So the reaction to due diligence, human rights due diligence, or national action plan is different across all of these categories, and also varies by the sectors in which these companies are and the location in which these companies are. It's very obvious that large multinationals are generally more aware comparatively, and this is perhaps because of policies and legislations at their headquarter country level. So I think that is generally seen. And a couple of years ago, I was associated with a civil society initiative where we were looking at disclosures of the top 100 listed companies in India. And it was very obvious that there were a lot of policies and disclosures around some of the more essential and compliance related issues. But when it came to social impact assessment or even environmental impact assessment, there was hardly any data. Even if some of the companies are disclosing that kind of data and information, it's very hard to believe that they find almost no issues in their supply chain, because I mean that will be far away from reality. In some of the sectors, for example, the textile sector, we have seen, again, comparatively, the sector is more mature on some of these trends. And we have also seen companies in the food and agriculture sector trying to come together and understanding these issues and trying to address this. This is also perhaps because of more integration in global value chains, lead firms sitting in Europe, North America, and other countries demanding some of these processes. But I will also go back to Zoha's point, and also the discussion in the human rights due diligence session yesterday, which Rishi was facilitating, that the approach is very much around an audit and a certification approach, which basically means that due diligence takes place. There is an audit report, which is mostly clean and green, but that's obviously not real. So how do you make sense of that data? And if there is a credibility issue and a quality issue in the data that is coming out from some of these due diligence, how are you going to bring about any sort of change? So I think that is a major issue with what we are seeing in this region. However, there are some good examples. Some companies have come forward, conducted due diligence in their supply chains. And when I say supply chains, it's also beyond tier 2 supply chains in some cases. And they have put the report out in public domain on their websites, and they've had some conversation on that. But again, these are very, very few examples, but good ones. What we need is those companies to engage with others and others to learn from their peers and come forward and do that. There is a sense of fear that if a company does due diligence, for example, if you look at the sugarcane sector, it's very obvious you're going to find bonded labor, child labor, and all sorts of exploitation in the supply chain. So there is this sense of fear that, all right, I do a due diligence, and if I truly come up and say that, yes, there is child labor and bonded labor in my supply chain, then what? What are the sensitivities at the local governance level, at the supplier level? Because the mindset is still, you come up with a report when everything is clean. If things are not clean, you don't talk about it. So that needs a fundamental shift to believe that this is a process and not an end in itself. However, we've seen recently there are some encouraging trends where companies, civil society, standard setting organizations coming together and starting to talk to each other, because this is a space where everybody is learning. These are very, very new developments, and learning and sharing is very important. What needs to happen more is these multi-stakeholder collaborations to go beyond just a conversation, but getting into more actions and pilots so that we can design solutions that can work everywhere. What is also clear that South Asian businesses need a lot of preparation to start making sense of their own supply chains. In most cases, companies don't even know what's down there beyond tier 1. Unless they know what the supply chain looks like, who are the constituents, what are the challenges they face, it will be very hard for them to come up and commit to a mandatory human rights due diligence. Right now, definitely beyond tier 1, most of the supply chains are very, very opaque, And that is where the challenges and the resistance comes from. If you look at any of the recent civil society reports on any supply chain issues of several large companies, it's very obvious that there are some grave human rights issues across the supply chains, be it in the textile sector, manufacturing sector, automobile, you name it, and there will be serious human rights issues in those sectors. Acknowledging that problems exist is the first step towards addressing these. And I think that's the most important reaction that I would want to see from South Asian and Indian businesses, that yes, there are issues and we want to solve some of these issues. The micro, small and medium enterprises and the very, very large informal sector is another major problem across this region and across Asia. These enterprises, entrepreneurs and workers are closer to impact. They understand some of these issues better than a company sitting in headquarters and some of the urban centers. But for them, the profit margins are very, very limited. Competition is very, very high. And the scope for them to bring about any change is very limited. So that needs to change for the informal and the MSME sector. What is also possible is for companies to come together because a lot of the suppliers often are common. So if they can, instead of doing their own due diligence, start working on sectoral due diligence, looking at a group of suppliers and then trying to address, I think that will be a good starting point. In terms of these multi-stakeholder approaches, one of the challenges that I've seen is about, where is the standard setting coming from? And Sean, you alluded to this, that a lot of this is happening top down, at least in this region. And what we have also seen is on some of these standard setting and multi-stakeholder platforms, the standards are coming from top down, and it's almost like, one size fits all kind of formula. That needs to change because that is not working. It promotes more of an audit-centric approach, and this defeats the purpose of human rights due diligence. What is needed is a more collaborative, contextual, and co-created approaches where workers, communities, organizations can see what is in it for them, bring businesses and other supply chain constituents on board, and then move forward with that. So I think that's how I would, it's a long and a winded answer, but I think that's how some of the reactions that I see from here.
Not long-winded at all. In fact, just rich and articulate. And I know you've got a lot of big fans there in India because of your approach to these the difficult subjects like mandatory human rights due diligence. For me, big takeaway is that there's a very diverse community of businesses in South Asia. I mean, it's a huge region, a huge sub-region, and you're going to have a huge amount of diversity. And things like a top-down approach to human rights due diligence are probably not going to work very well for a number of reasons. But one is that one size does not fit all in a region with the private sector as diverse as it is there. You started off by saying a lot about the data, and this really a fear of releasing data. You get too many reports where there's just nothing wrong, as you said, and it's not credible. All the audits come out clean and green. And you say that's based on a great deal of fear in the community, probably similar to what Zoha said. There's a fear of the liability of unpacking things and people being very uncomfortable with what's being found and being perhaps punished disproportionately than the actual underlying harm. So fear is driving this problem. You said as a potential solution, a shift in mindsets. And that might require more support from multinational corporations, peer learning, but also perhaps a sectoral approaches, attacking issues, especially in the more riskier industries towards things like child labor, unpacking those problems together. You also said that most, and I found this really interesting, that most businesses in India themselves don't know their business partners or their supply chains beyond tier one. Of course, that's also common accusation against large multinationals based out of Europe, North America, elsewhere. So a common problem in different kinds of countries in different kinds of regions. Thank you for an excellent presentation or opening there. Quick question for you though is you said, as I said before, you love disruption. You find that this is what causes positive change. Is the pressure coming out of places like Europe on mandatory human rights due diligence? Is it a disruptive force, or is it something on the horizon is worrying people? Is it immediate? Is it exigent? Is it pushing companies in India to change things radically? Just give me a brief reaction, if you would.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not a disruption yet, because like Tim mentioned, that it's still in process. But I do believe that once some of the big trading partners in the context of India, for example, have those legislations, then there will be, this negative externality that, say European companies have an unlevel playing field, and it will create pressure and disruption for governments in this context to also respond. So I do see in the near future, it is going to have an impact, but right now it's wait and watch.
Okay, wait and watch. Closing words from Namit for now. Let us move forward, Namit, you and me and the rest of our team here, and ask Muriel the question that has been bothering me all night. It's almost like a riddle. Tell us, Muriel, what do trees and t-shirts have in common? If you could start with that, and then I'll ask a more focused question.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Actually, what trees and t-shirts have in common is actually something that Zoha mentioned. So before when I was working in the forest sector, I was actually working on governance issues and how do you ensure that legal timber is only the one exploited and exported. And so one of the big one of the big issues is actually the legal enforcement. You have laws, but then they're not enforced and they're not monitored, and companies too often can still do what they want. And so it really echoed what Zoha was saying about, in Pakistan, there are laws and standards on different issues, but the legal enforcement is missing. So that was really one of the commonalities that I've been seeing in those two different, very different sectors, but which face similar issues on a number of topics.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And it's purely logical in the end, as I knew it would be. Let me ask you this, in the interest of time, go right to my most burning question, and that is that I'm wondering whether there's an gender dimension to mandatory human rights due diligence, that in fact, the garment industry, as you know very well, is populated by many women workers. What kind of impact would the imposition of mandatory human rights due diligence on European companies have on South Asia and other economies in our region here?
Yes, thank you. Just before replying to your question, I just wanted to really thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be able to speak at this event, present Clean Clothes Campaign recommendation, and also learn from my co-panelists, because it's been really interesting. So just for those who do not know Clean Clothes Campaign, we are a global network of trade unions and NGOs working on defending garment workers' rights. We are composed of over 200 members and partners, active in 45 countries, and this includes Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka. And so to respond to your question on the gender aspect, when we talk about the garment sector, we know really well that it's estimated that over 80% of the garment industry is composed of female workers. And, the industry has been profiting from and perpetuating gender discrimination. When it comes to employment and wages, we know that women, tend to be overworked, tend to be underpaid. They hold the most precarious forms of employment as well. And then they also face a specific type of violence and discrimination. And on that, for instance, last year in 2020, Clean Clothes Campaign, together with its partner in Germany and Bangladesh, we did a research on that topic. And we interviewed 600 workers in Bangladesh, and 75% of them replied that they did face gender-based violence, and as well as sexual harassment. So that means those specific risks that are faced by women, that means that, when a company does human rights due diligence, they have to make sure that it is gender sensitive. And by that, we mean that, they should be actively reaching out to, let's say, workers association, women workers. They should think about how to do that reaching out, how to frame questions, how to engage, what are the specific risks, what can company do, what should be specific measures to remedy and to mitigate the risk. And so, we have been pushing hard for the EU law and the German law to include those perspectives. And of course, this is still an ongoing discussion. But for us, that would be one of the key aspects of any human rights due diligence process to make sure that it can be impactful. Just to finish, I think that also at the level of governments, both at the EU level and also at in Pakistan, India, etc. There is also the question and the possibility of actually signing and ratifying the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment at Work, because that convention was, I think, prepared 1 or 2 years ago, and that has been a great progress. And so with the ratification, that would also allow to facilitate the HRDD perspective for women.
Thank you very much, Muriel. I appreciate those perspectives. Some interesting facts here. And 80% of all workers are women in the garment industry, and a very powerful statement that profit is being made off the back of women's discrimination, and that women's perspectives on MHRDD has been key to the Clean Clothes campaign in developing the EU and other legislative proposals in this space. So first of all, I want to say I applaud you for not just keeping the issues front and center, but also in part for your getting the proposal from the EU as far as it has. I've taken a look at it myself. I found that it had contained more than I thought it would. Includes more business. It would throw a net over a wider size and group of businesses than I think some of us imagined. There's even a significant section on grievance mechanisms and the need to have those. I'm wondering from your perspective, going back to the MHRDD again, what is there any danger that the efforts in Europe and elsewhere might actually cause for people to draw down from working in areas with certain garment industries in certain countries because the risks are either too expensive to unpack, to address, maybe because there's other markets to put operations or to expand operations. Might we have an unintended effect if we push mandatory human rights due diligence too far for women working in the garment industry?
Yes, thank you, Sean. I think just to go back a bit to the EU parliamentary resolution, I think that for us as civil society, it's been quite interesting and exciting to see that there was finally a concrete development at the EU level on tabling a mandatory legislation. That was something that we had been pushing for a long time, because there was the consideration that voluntary practices were not enough, and that they were failing to meet their objectives, and that there was a need for binding legislation. So indeed, the parliamentary report gives a strong message. It's actually quite interesting to see that indeed it focuses on human rights due diligence, but also environment, also good governance, meaning, for instance, corruption. It casts a wide net on companies, etc. And so those are key elements, and also includes references to civil liability. So those are really key messages that are being sent to European stakeholders, as well as the European Commission, that will be the one tabling a legislative proposal on the topic in June. So that has been really encouraging, and we have been really supportive of that process. And so to go back to your question on what are the risks also of disengagement, I think that for us as civil society, it comes back to what is human rights due diligence as per the UN guiding principle, as per the OECD guidelines, etc. And this is what we are basing our advocacy and our logic on. And due diligence is it's a process based on progress. We're not asking, there is no expectation that when a company identifies a risk in a supply chain, the answer should not be, okay, I will just leave. That's not what we want, not at all. What we want is that the company engages with the issue and actually actively works to, engage with stakeholders and promotes the progress. Because, as the previous speaker mentioned, there are reports on what are the issues, and, audit and certification reports are saying that everything is fine, because everyone is too scared to actually say the truth and to say that there are issues. So really, for us, the question of due diligence is about how to make sure that processes are in place to be able to prevent and identify those risks, mitigate those risks, and really, work with the value chain and work with the suppliers and work with the workers to make sure that, we are on an improvement pathway. Of course, then, in some cases, there should be procedures for liability and accountability of companies, when a harm is done or when the due diligence is not being done, because you need to have those strong enforcement and, let's say, sanction mechanism to make sure that the law has teeth. But of course, we're still in the perspective of, progressive improvements.
Okay, Muriel, I'm going to stay with you, and I promise I'm not putting you on the spot for no reason if I'm in fact putting you on the spot. I just want to unpack this a little bit further, because we're getting a lot of questions as you're speaking, and they're addressed to you. Let me read this one, which you answered in part, but perhaps you'd like to expand on further. The practice of audits was introduced by several multi-stakeholder groups in the garment industry supply chain to improve working conditions several years back. Now, given that HRDD is again dealing with the same actors, how much more can we expect in terms of a pro-worker, pro-environment operations in these garment factories? Often a change, the point of this question is often a change in vocabulary brings a realignment of priorities, but does it bring also more accountability? If you could answer that as briefly as possible, and then I want to turn to Tim.
Yes, thanks, Sean. I think it's a great question, because the issue of auditing and certification and what will be their role in the perspective of mandatory human rights due diligence is a big one. And us at Clean Close campaign, we have been pushing back against those initiatives, because in our work, Zoha mentioned the IFI enterprise.
You can ask this one. I'm a big supporter. You can ask this one.
The Ali Enterprise fire, where actually the company had been certified, but that was, with zero impact, and actually, the standards were not up to level. So for us, the auditing industry, the certification industry, can provide a false image of what's actually, needed and what's actually the situation on human rights compliance. So we're really concerned about that risk, that possibility. At the moment, at the EU level, there are no recognition, no official recognition of those initiatives. And furthermore, actually, the European Parliament's resolution said that those certification and auditing schemes could not be considered as automatic evidence that the company is doing its human rights due diligence. So for us, that's one of the ways to make sure that we do not fall towards this, let's say, auditing compliance pathway. And the other one is to make sure that the law, the future EU law or the future German law, includes strong liability aspects, both for the companies, but also hopefully for the auditing and certification industry, to make sure, to also put another binding incentive to them actually, doing their part and doing the actual work of making sure that companies are up to level when it comes to human rights and environmental compliance.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, for your response to that question, right? A difficult question actually to navigate. You did so with aplomb. I'd like to go back, go back to the top of the circle now and put a question to Tim. Tim, if you're still there with us, Some say that the rise of mandatory human rights due diligence is evidence that the voluntary nature of UN guiding principles is not really working out. And therefore, states had to bring in some liability, and they brought it in under this pillar 2. They brought in mandatory human rights due diligence. Tim, I'm going to ask each of you to comment perhaps, but Tim, can you start us off by answering this statement, making a comment on this statement? Is there actually complementarity between UN guiding principles and mandatory human rights due diligence?
In Germany, we are always saying, or we have a common saying to trust is good, but controlling is better. So this was the German way to discuss it further on. And as Muriel said, this law must have teeth, maybe in the beginning little, and then they could grow a little bit. And but I think, as Namit said, you have to share and you have to learn. And Rishi of our network, and Namit is part of our network too, we just had these voluntary measures. It's a bigger freedom to create an ecosystem to share and to learn. But in the end, this monitoring process in Germany showed in the end it was not enough. So we tried it, or we have been trying it for 4 years to do it. But in the end, maybe, as Muriel said, it's a process. And then in the end, there must be a consequence. I think this was a good way. And Rishi asked in the questions, how can we build up capacity in the business environment? And so we are, and how is it including Indian companies, as Namit said? We called our network Indo-German Network for Business and Human Rights because on the one hand, it's obvious that producing goods and offering services through German entities here in India is leading directly through the several supply chains in the Indian economy. So if the German company is obliged to do it and to look in the Indian supply chain, then there is an impact. Maybe not on the huge scale, but in this direct business exchange, there is an impact. And I think it's very important to go this way. And of course, as Soha said, always in Pakistan, there are German companies too. And if they are obliged now, if the parliament is deciding like that, or on the European level, then it will be changing also in the countries where German companies are engaged. So it's a vice versa thing. And I think we need bigger understanding and a learning, and it needs time, but there is a push forward now, and I'm hopeful that we are coming on the right way.
Thank you. Tim, we had some technical difficulties on our side here. You may notice the change in the camera angle, but luckily I had Kevin in the room with me, and we've switched to a smaller laptop. I wasn't able to hear most of your answer, but I know it was a good one since your expressions were very passionate. I'm going to now just, I mentioned that I had I wanted other speakers to answer the same question, but as I was getting some of the questions switching to my phone, there was one to Namit in particular. Namit, do you think that multi-stakeholder initiatives like the ones that have been employed in Germany or the Netherlands around garment agreements would also be helpful in South Asian countries? Could you expand on that, please?
Thanks for that question, Sean. I think there are already a lot of international MSIs who are engaged in India. And they always have a role. They always support some of these processes. But I think, it's also important to change the approach in how MSIs engage in certain contexts, because it has to be a co-creation approach rather than a top-down approach. And I think that's what I would say. So it's not just about, if there is a German MSI or any other MSI coming and working and trying to influence some of these processes, build capacity, but how do you make sure that it works in the Indian context or the South Asian context and work with, I think one of the other comment was around, they end up working with the same kind of stakeholders. What about the workers and communities? So I think that is where the issue is. So until and unless these MSIs are able to be more inclusive, have conversations with workers, communities, and those who are actually affected, get their viewpoints in, I think that's a transformation that is definitely needed.
Thank you, Namit. I could see you nodding. I think that means you could hear me. I could hear you, and I appreciate that very much. But I now then want to go back to Tim real quickly and ask him. Tell me about how. I know that trade unions, civil society, you had an all-in approach towards the development of your NAP, which of course gave rise to legislation on human rights due diligence. We recall you had a tense national debate, but did trade unionists in Germany also reach out to trade unionists in South Asia, for example, in India? Has there been a dialogue between South Asia and Europe around things like human rights due diligence? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. As I maybe mentioned, the umbrella organization of the German trade unions are very much engaged in this international relations within the international organizations of trade unions. And there's a big exchange and a big view on this human rights due diligence. And especially in the sectors of transport, there is strong bow to the, for example, the Indian side, and a big exchange. And for the trade unions and the NGO, if the new law is coming, they try to figure out how the violations of human rights are taking place, and they can claim it then in Germany. And so I think it will grow in this side too. And but there's a strong relationship between the trade unions and a good working basis in the international organization. Of course.
Thank you for that, and for repeating yourself, and not repeating yourself, but reviewing again the important comments you made about the importance of these umbrella organizations. We're still working through some technical issues. So if you see me distracted while you guys are talking, it's not out of interest. It's out of us trying to survive at this point. Luckily we have Kevin here. Oh, and Kevin's going to ask a question too, he says. But let me ask Zoha a question next, because something she said to me, maybe it was a couple of days ago now, which I thought was worth unpacking further, and that is with regards to the rate of change happening in Pakistan. You made some pretty authoritative statements saying, oh, well, in Pakistan currently, we have a big problem in the implementation of policy. It has to be voluntary. And yet you also spoke about how rapidly the environment in Pakistan has changed, how much more receptive business is to a discussion about even human rights due diligence, regardless of these challenges. How did those two things square? And tell us in particular just how much has changed in the last 2 years that you've been active on business and human rights in Pakistan.
Right. Thank you, Sean. I think the most interesting aspect of looking at how businesses are receptive but resistant at the same time is the way that the government is working with them. So if we bring in voluntary standards, and if we talk about persuasion and just encouraging them to understand how business activity is impacting human rights, you see a lot of good responses. During our consultations, we have seen businesses are receptive to it. We've seen that just this angle that internationally human rights due diligence is something that is extremely important and is a prerequisite to doing business outside of Pakistan is taken well. However, the minute you start talking about more controversial ideas such as transparency, such as publicly reporting due diligence mechanisms. That is something that faces a lot of resistance. And I think that is something that the government will continue to struggle with as well, because while during the last 2 years, businesses have gone from not knowing what business and human rights is to sort of understanding and to sort of even being encouraged to partake within the creation of human rights policies within their own businesses, we've seen that this is an approach that sort of goes around. The response has been they would pick on things that work for them, and then they will not pick on things that don't work for them right now. So it is basically a balancing exercise where they're trying to look at things that fit well with their economic priorities and with their business activity. But when you go into bigger areas such as bonded labor and child labor and transparency and accountability, you will see a lot of resistance. So which is why, while we've seen rapid improvement, this is not the end, and this is just the start of a very long journey for Pakistan, because we are at the beginning of our business and human rights journey. We've only just published the first draft, which means that while you're creating awareness campaigns and you're disseminating the idea of business and human rights, and your trade organizations and your business organizations and generally your relevant stakeholders are only trying to understand this concept right now, going on from here is going to be a more sort of struggle-filled exercise, because now is the time where you start talking about more difficult areas, and now is the time that you start talking about implementation. And I think now we'll be able to see better how businesses receive us, because initially the idea was only to explain to them how their businesses are impacting human rights, and to that extent they have been receptive. But once we start talking about enforcement, and once we get to that stage where we're asking them to be transparent and disclose information, that is, I think, is going to be a struggle, and that is going to take a while for businesses to be open and for them to exchange information, relevant and adequate information with us as well.
And what role, you spoke to me a lot about the role of youth in Pakistan, and how pushing, and in general, a rights agenda in many spaces, for example, on women's rights, etc. What role do the youth have in pushing business and human rights in Pakistan? Also, is there interest in subjects as technical as human rights due diligence among your generation? How do we leverage that?
I think when we look at the Pakistani context, we've seen, and this has been very interesting, because while the government has been taking a top-down approach and we're engaging with bigger corporations and bigger businesses, we see smaller businesses that are driven by young people right now, especially in cities where we could not have expected change to happen, such as Peshawar and KPK, which is generally like a province of Pakistan that usually lags behind, and Balochistan. We've seen it is the energy of the youth that is really driving the human rights agenda. And we don't only see it within the business and human rights agenda, we see it with other areas as well, where you have, for example, the Women's March, which is driven by young people in Pakistan. So I think that is an untapped resource where the government also needs to introduce these policies where they give the youth the forums to actually talk about areas that matter. And I think that can be one thing where we can use businesses to persuade them, or we can use it to persuade businesses to sort of introduce human rights due diligence policies as well. Because even though young people here are just starting out on the human rights agenda, it is because they're engaging with other entities that they know of these technical subjects, and they can provide guidance on how to conduct human rights due diligence. For example, even my organization, we started out creating these templates and these checklists to sort of identify to businesses that these are the things that you have to do. It does not go beyond this. So why don't you start out with this? So I think that is something that is an area of interest for everybody, but it is one thing to use the youth to sort of persuade larger businesses and to sort of use smaller businesses that are driven by young people as a sample and as an example setting format here for bigger businesses to look at as well.
Thank you very much, Zoha. Another comprehensive response. I want to ask Muriel now a question with regards to going back to mandatory human rights due diligence and new proposals coming out of Europe. There's portions of which to talk about in the proposals provided by provided by the EU parliamentary proposal, which came again, which landed on March 10th, or was tabled on March 10th. There's a good deal in there about civil liability. I'm wondering what impact you think civil liability will have on women's rights in South Asia. For those who find this to be rather cryptic, what is he talking about? Basically, the parliamentary proposals would allow for businesses in Europe to be sued by people who are living in Pakistan who are impacted by the operations of businesses in Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken, at least. That's my understanding. Muriel, have you given any thought to this impact or to this opportunity?
Yes, thank you, Sean. So yeah, just to go back to the question of the civil liability, I think that was something that for us as again, civil society, Clean Clothes Campaign, a law on human rights due diligence that would not include clauses on liability. So in that case, it's civil liability, but actually we would also push for criminal liability. So a human rights due diligence law that would not include this question of access to justice would not fulfill its role and would not have the needed impact. Because what we've been seeing is that, you know, like too often when there have been cases of human rights abuses in those international value chains, victims have been trying to get access to justice, not only in the country where the abuse took place, but also to be able to sue in the country where let's say the company is headquartered. And it's been extremely, extremely difficult for questions of, you know, absence of civil liability, for questions of the fact that, you know, you're trying to sue the brand, even though it's a supplier, it's the abuse took place at the place of the supplier. Also questions around the statute of limitation or the question of the burden of proof, where actually victims have to, you know, show the evidence, and meaning documents that they don't necessarily have access to. So for us, that's, you know, this question of civil liability and liability is key. And that would be, you know, that would bring an impact and a positive impact on, you know, on workers in the garment sector, so on women and, you know, workers in themselves, because then that would mean not only when there is a harm, you know, there is this possibility of accessing justice and accessing judicial courts, but it will also have, you know, an indirect impact. First, you know, that gives the idea of a law that will have teeth, where you actually have a sanction under the idea of civil liability. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, that will be a big push for companies to actually act and prevent, you know, those abuses. If they know that they can be held liable for failure to do due diligence and for failure to act when they see something wrong, then that will push them for action. And that's what we want. And I think the other thing is that, you know, in the context of the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD, there are talks about access to judicial remedies, as well as access to non-judicial remedies and access to grievance mechanism. And our experience at Clean Clothes Campaign has been that, you know, you need to have both those type of remedies, both judicial and non-judicial, to work together and be strong. Because if you only have grievance mechanisms that are, you know, basically between the workers or the trade unions and the company, it's voluntary. And, you know, there is not necessarily a big incentive for companies to provide strong and comprehensive remedies. So by having also this aspect of liability, you also, you know, strengthen the question of the grievance mechanisms, and which may be also sometimes more accessible to workers, including female workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that was the interesting part of the proposed legislation in the EU too, was more of a focus on grievance mechanisms, which is outside of human rights due diligence typically, as it's understood. And I was glad to see that. I am wondering whether in this time of economic crisis, economic recovery, the appetite for the business community for this kind of thing is all that strong. I have a question for Namit on this. Thank you, Muriel, for your reflections. Namit, this is coming from Nusrat Khan in India. She asked, how do we convince, what's a practical way of convincing businesses to embrace human rights due diligence in the context of India's economic slowdown and/or wider human rights abuses that might be occurring in their supply chain. You did make comments about making it seem like a competitive edge to businesses to do human rights due diligence. But how do we articulate in a way that doesn't sound like we're more preaching than anything else? What really resonates with the corporates when we're talking about human rights due diligence? Thanks.
Thanks, Sean and Nusrat, for this question. I think the issue of business case for National Action Plan or human rights due diligence has always been challenging. And I mean, it will be unfair to say that I have an answer because I don't have a clear answer, but I think there needs to be a conducive environment within which businesses can start adopting some of these new trends that are coming in. And I think governments have a very, very important role to play that facilitative role. And I think to an extent, what Tim also alluded to, that governments often have this command and control stance, which is where a lot of the unintended consequences, whether it's fudging audits and data and all of that come in. It's important for governments to start looking at human rights due diligence or mandatory human rights due diligence as a process where supply chains and the economy can be more transparent, safer, sustainable, and it leads to long-term prosperity. What we've seen in the last decade or even more is the moment you start talking about human rights, transparency, accountability, this is seen as juxtaposed opposite to economic progress and something that is going to stop economic progress. So I think that sort of a stance coming from the government and others is obviously not supporting some of these ideas. It's important for the government to take a long-term approach on why human rights due diligence and businesses supporting human rights is important, and then facilitate that process. It's also important, I think there was one question around mechanisms, and Mariel also spoke about non-judicial mechanisms. I think that is going to be significantly important, because even if a company wants to have a due diligence process, a grievance mechanism, but where do the communities or workers who want to go ahead with that, what access to justice do they have? What is important is to look at the state capacity. I mean, if a worker or a community member has a grievance, it is impossible for that person to approach the local police or go to the courts and get justice. What we need is something more localized, something more institutionalized, so that if there is an issue that can be sorted at the local level with participation of industry associations, business, community, and everyone, without necessarily going to a judicial process, because we are already overburdened there. So once we have this conducive environment and businesses are more aware of this, and with the government playing a very facilitative role, I think it will be much easier to convince business to walk the path of human rights due diligence.
Fantastic. Naminit, I've actually had some conversations with some some senior managers in large companies here in Thailand recently, and they said their companies want to go global. Thai market's too small for them now. But as they move into new markets, they're finding that they're under greater scrutiny. So they've really got to ramp up their corporate governance, and so the impact of things like the mandatory human rights due diligence are actually being seen as very significant bottom line issues. Whether that's the only way that it should be seen or not is of course open to debate. But another argument I think that to add to the many good ones you've made is that businesses, if they want to become international, they need to adopt international standards, and that often means ratcheting up to the highest standards wherever they may be. It's just a typical business approach. You reach for the higher standards, and you can do business in any of the other markets beneath it with softer regulatory commands. Also, this year we've had we've seen the U.S. government make better use of what's called withhold release orders, actually stopping products at the borders after finding credible allegations of forced labor and other human rights risks in the mix of products that were shipped to the States. So you've seen that with regards to both China and Malaysia, sending back, in fact, rubber gloves and other PPE that's necessary to manage COVID. So that's also a very real threat on the macro level, of course, but perhaps the right reason to embrace human rights due diligence. And third one, there was we didn't actually go too far into this, and it's a sensitive one, but there is of course divestment campaigns from shareholders of large pension funds or pension holders from large pension funds and other large investment institutions. Again, another reason why businesses large and small, but with exposure to and opportunity from international investors should start looking at human rights due diligence more significantly. We're about to run out of time. Kevin just put his phone on my plate, asking me to ask this question here. It's so small I could barely read it. Yes, I see it. I'm pointing at it, but I'm not going to be able to. The font is like 0.5 font. No, I don't want you to read it, silly. We're about to close here. Let me plug this. Rather, let me make a final plug for UNDP, or rather a plug for UNDP as we close. And perhaps if there's time, give the last word to one of you. We're working in partnership with the European Union, so this conversation is particularly important. We are also working in some of the primary economies of the region, including India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. I could go on and on. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Mongolia. We're growing from just 6 to 11. We might even go bigger still. I'll leave that as a cliffhanger. But in these countries, we are pushing human rights due diligence concepts pretty strongly, doing trainings with business associations and other. And I just want to say thanks to Namit, Zoha, Muriel, Tim for your support in that effort. And I want to tell you and the rest of our listeners that we have a human rights training facilitation guide that will be published soon. Might try to time that with the Commission's response to the EU parliamentary proposal. And this training facilitation guide is not meant, it's not a one-size-fits-all training. It's just the basics, but there's some very helpful exercises and what have you that we hope you'll reflect on and take forward. There's also a bit of training software to help companies understand how to prioritize human rights risks under the guidelines that are provided by the UN Guiding Principles. So to bring those upcoming products to your attention. But I wanted to ask everyone to just give me one word. I won't have time to put it on the board behind me, but give me one word or one sentence that you really want to leave people with as we exit this session. I'm going to start where we started today with Tim there in Kerala.
Yes, optimism. I want to stress optimism. Otherwise, it's such a high-flying thing, and as all people are in the forum and all listeners are knowing, just to claim it and to write it in paper, that's easy, but to do it and maybe optimism to do it and to try it and to share and to learn. Thank you.
Excellent. Zoha.
Right. I think I'm going to again emphasize on implementation. Identify your challenges. Do not be afraid of criticism and be transparent. And I think that is something that we need in Pakistan.
I could live my life that way too and probably benefit. I think Namit, you would be next.
Sure. I would say taking a systems view, because often these conversations are in these silos. So it's important when we talk about human rights due diligence or business and human rights, we take a full systems view, localize and contextualize the implementation.
Fantastic. Muriel, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you. I think that for me, the 2 points that I really want to emphasize again is the fact that, like in any law, you need to have freedom of association, engagement of stakeholders. That's really key. And also that companies actually also will need to include purchasing practices. And those are the two principles that without the two ideas, it will be extremely difficult to get an impactful human rights due diligence law.
Well, thank you, Muriel, for that. So I'm feeling optimistic that we're going to be focusing more on, on implementation, taking a systems view, and along the way, leveraging and or making greater efforts to ensure freedom of association and multi-stakeholder engagement. And indeed, let's look at the role of large multinationals too, and their purchasing practices, their purchasing power, because it's a big part of this mix. And unfortunately, we didn't get to unpack that as much as I would like to, even though we were focused a lot on the European context. But that's a conversation for another time. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's been an enlightening discussion, and looking forward to our next engagement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.